This episode of the podcast is aiming towards a discussion of playtest. And for those of you who have seen that already, you might appreciate already why I'm going to talk about tragedy and dreaming. So for tragedy, I'm going to be discussing Nietzsche's first major book, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, and his theory of tragedy and why we find it appealing. And secondly, for dreaming, I will be discussing Freud's theory, one of his magnum operas, The Interpretation of Dreams from 1899-1900, his really definitive book of his early career. And he condensed it later into a short essay called On Dreams, and I'll be drawing my material from that. But since Greek tragedy is important to both of them, obviously, I should say not obviously, but Freud is known for his Oedipus complex, and Nietzsche is discussing Greek tragedy. And so I feel that it's a good idea to start with a particular Greek tragedy. And in that case, I've chosen Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. So 3 things I'd like to discuss today: Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, and Freud's theory of dreams. So starting with Sophocles, when you pick up the Oedipus Rex for the first time, it's disorienting in the same way that, other Greek tragedies are disorienting. The first thing to be said about them is that they were performed with a musical accompaniment in the way that we now enjoy operas or movies. So to read Sophocles now would be like reading the script of a tragic film from Hollywood or any other place. So you're missing a lot by just reading it. Now, obviously, you're missing things in translation as well, but you're missing the musical accompaniment and the dramatic production and also the religious context. These tragedies, the great ones that survive for us, were performed at a festival in Athens called the Greater Dionysia. So it was a festival in honor of Dionysus, the god of wine, the god who drew women outside the city, women who often weren't allowed outside the house in public. And so he encouraged people to break social conventions, rather like, the Grateful Dead coming to a town and the town getting turned upside down by the revelry. So that's all missing when we read text and translation nowadays in a college classroom of, say, Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. So that's one thing to be remembered. The other is that Sophocles, like many ancient authors, begins in what's called in medias res, which is Latin for in the middle of things. His audience would have known the story of Oedipus. So Sophocles' purpose is not to tell you the story from the beginning, chronologically, but rather, assuming that you know the major events, to give it to you in a novel way. And yet, for many readers approaching that text for the first time, they don't know the full story. So I'm going to just give you the background for the story and then enter into the play briefly, again, for the purpose, ultimately, of discussing Nietzsche and Freud. So the first thing, how far back do you go in Greek mythology to explain this play? I think you need to go back to a curse that was laid upon Laius, who was Oedipus's father, and his wife, Jocasta. So his mother and father were cursed to have a son who would kill the father, Laius, and sleep with the mother, Jocasta. And they tried to avoid this curse by, upon the birth of their son, having him killed. The way the Greeks killed children, and I don't want to say it was, it's not unusual, but this isn't something that would be unheard of. They exposed the baby. So they didn't slit the throat of the baby directly. What they would do is have it taken out into the woods, and they would leave it there. So Laius and Jocasta decided to have this done to their son Oedipus. And in order to do so, they bound his feet. And the name in Greek, Oedipus, means sore foot. So his feet are bound, so he can't even walk, even as a baby. And he's given to a trusted servant or slave who is also a shepherd. And that shepherd is to take Oedipus to Mount Kithyron, a distant mountain on the border with a neighboring town, and leave him there to die. So Laius and Jocasta are king and queen of Thebes, and this trusted servant goes to Mount Kithaeron, which is on the border between Thebes and Corinth, the territory of Corinth, that is. So happens that a shepherd from Corinth is visiting the same mountain at the same time, and the shepherd from Thebes and he are friends. They meet there every season to feed their flock. And taking pity on the baby Oedipus, the shepherd from Thebes gives the baby to the shepherd from Corinth. It so happens that the king and queen of Corinth are childless, and knowing this, the shepherd, the trusted shepherd of the Corinthian household, the royal Corinthian household, knowing this, he sees an opportunity to bring the baby Oedipus to Polybus and Merope, king and queen of Corinth, so that they may have an heir. He does so. Oedipus grows up in Corinth, thinking that Polybus and Merope are his natural parents. And in the play itself, we're told by Oedipus that he was told by, I think, a drinking companion that he was not the natural son of Polybus and Merope. And he grows angry and immediately departs for the temple of Apollo at Delphi, where there's an oracle important in the Greek world for divining important truths from the gods. Oedipus goes there to find out whether or not he is the natural born son of Polybus and Merope. That's the question that he puts to the god, to the priestess. And the answer comes back that he will kill his father and sleep with his mother. And this is the first indication we get of Oedipus. Well, I suppose the first indication we get of him is that he grows enraged at that drinking companion and departs immediately for Delphi, when a reasonable response might be to find out the facts from this friend, or go to his parents, Polybus and Merope, to find out the truth. Instead, he flees to the oracle and he puts that question, and the answer he gets is not an answer to that question. It's instead this prophecy that he'll kill his father and sleep with his mother. And this is another indication of Oedipus's character. He, hearing that, decides not to go back to Corinth. He's now assuming the very thing that he went there to question. He's assuming now that Polybus and Merope are his natural parents, and he thinks that he can avoid the fate that Apollo has just told him, that is, that he'll kill his father and sleep with his mother, by refusing to go back to Corinth. So he sets off in another direction. He heads for Thebes. And as he's traveling this road to Thebes, he comes to a crossroads, and a royal procession is coming in the other direction. It's the king of Thebes, Laius, with several servants, I think 5. And the king or some of the servants push him out of the way. And I think the king even strikes him on the head. And Oedipus again grows enraged, and is characteristic of Greek heroes. He not just grows enraged, but grows superhumanly powerful. And he kills all but one of them. He kills the king and all the servants or slaves but one, who escapes. Then he travels down the rest of the road, and he arrives at Thebes, we have to assume within a few days, and finds the town distraught, because not only have they lost their king, but also they've been bedeviled by a sphinx, a mythic bird, who has been robbing them of their sons, I believe, and will continue to do so until they solve his riddle, or her riddle, I guess. The Sphinx is female, if I'm not mistaken. And the riddle is, what animal or what creature walks on or moves on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening? And no one had been able to guess this until Oedipus arrives. He guesses correctly that it's the human being, or man in the characteristic translations. Anthropos is the word from which we get anthropology. And the solution is that we walk on 4 legs in the morning. When we're babies, we crawl and we stand upright when we're adults. And then finally, in our old age, we walk with a cane. And significantly, in a subsequent play, the Oedipus Colonis, Oedipus walks with a cane because, as we know from this play, he goes blind. He blinds himself. So in this play, Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus Tyrannos in Greek, he is on 2 legs, standing proud, now the king of Thebes, because the population is so grateful that he saved them from the Sphinx's depredations that they make him king. So now he is the husband of Jocasta, and the prophecy has been fulfilled. So an important lesson of the play for Greek religion is that first, Laius and Jocasta tried to avoid their fate, and in their very effort to avoid it, brought it about. And secondly, Oedipus, when he heard his fate at the Apollo oracle in Delphi, he too tried to avoid it, and by avoiding it, brought it about. But we also see more glimmers of Oedipus's character. He's not only the brilliant man who solves the riddle no one else could solve, as he never ceases to remind us, but he, just having killed a man who probably looked like him to some extent, although we can forgive him for not seeing that in his rage, shortly after arriving in the town that has just lost a king of that age, he doesn't make the connection that he has killed the king. Secondly, he marries the king's wife, namely Jocasta, who we have to assume is about 20 years older than him, the age that his mother would have been, the wife of the man that he'd killed. And despite his cleverness, the only man who was able to figure out the riddle of the Sphinx, he's not able to put those obvious clues together. And it's a testament to the dramatic genius of Sophocles that you can read this play and see this play, and that those obvious facts don't typically occur. I mean, I'm not going to say a smart audience member is not going to catch them, but I know the first time I read this play, the first time I saw it, I didn't notice those things. And yet once they're pointed out to you, it's amazing that anybody could have, us, that we'd not seen them, and that Oedipus himself would not have noticed those things. And so, again, Sophocles' dramatic genius by putting us in the position of Oedipus, not noticing the most obvious things. And that's true of Oedipus, that he is brilliant with abstractions. He knows the nature of the human being, which is what that riddle testifies to, but he is unable to see basic facts about his own life. So he's a paragon of wisdom in the abstract with self-deception in the particular. Sophocles warning against the dangers, I think, of philosophy, philosophy that doesn't attend to the particularities of the philosopher who's philosophizing. And there's an excellent book on this, by the way, called Oedipus Philosopher by Jean-Joseph Gou, translated into English in the 90s. So, having arrived in Thebes, becoming king, marrying the queen, his mother, he's now installed, and he has 4 children with her, and a certain amount of time has passed before the play begins. And at this point, the play begins. I mean, the children must be teenagers at any rate. And the first scene is the chorus arriving, representing the townspeople of Thebes, arriving before Oedipus and begging him for help with the crisis of the city, which is a plague. And they learn that the plague will not be relieved. It's divine punishment. The plague will not be relieved until the murderer of their former king, Laius, is revealed. So Oedipus embarks on a quest. He doesn't go anywhere. He embarks on an intellectual quest, as is characteristic of him, to find the murderer of Laius. And he deals with 3 important witnesses in that quest. The first is Tiresias, the blind seer, who arrives and knows the answer. In fact, must have known all along that it was Oedipus who had done this, and yet remains silent. And so we have to assume, as he himself says, that the reason he will not tell the truth is that he knows how Oedipus will react if he tells him the truth. That is, he'll get enraged, as we saw earlier in the play. So that strategy doesn't work well, because when Tiresias says, well, I'm not going to tell you, even though I know, because you're going to get enraged, Oedipus gets enraged at that and thinks that Tiresias is using his religious privileges to unseat him, or at least to criticize his authority. Oedipus adopts the same strategy with Creon, his brother-in-law, Jocasta's brother, who has gone to Apollo to find out the answer. And he treats Creon with the same contempt he treated Tiresias. That is, he thinks that Creon is trying to unseat him. and in fact threatens to execute him, and then I believe to exile him. And then finally, a shepherd is recalled. This is a shepherd who works in the distant fields, and we eventually learn had been in the household of Laius and Jocasta before Laius was murdered. And eventually we find out he was the one servant or slave who was present when Laius was killed. And when Oedipus arrived in town, he fled out to the hinterland of the Theban territory, presumably because he saw that the very murderer of Laius was now the king, and he didn't want to threaten Oedipus's authority, and he probably expected some kind of punishment. So Oedipus tortures him, and through this torture and through the evidence, and eventually through a message that arrives from Corinth that Oedipus's adoptive parents, Polybus and Merope, have died, that he is now king, but that messenger turns out to be the very Corinthian shepherd who met the Theban shepherd on the Mount Kithaeron. And so at this point, it becomes unmistakable, and Oedipus puts together all the facts. And at this point, Jocasta, who's put them together already, has killed herself. And when Oedipus finds her hanging, he takes the brooches from her garments and pokes out his own eyes in self-punishment for relying on his own ability to see and going so far astray. So this is going to be an example for us of a tragedy as we pivot now to discuss Nietzsche, and as a forecast, it's also going to be an example of structure of dreams for Freud, artworks as well. But also just looking 2 weeks ahead, if you will, although we're going to be discussing playtest immediately, after some more philosophical material, more Freud, in fact, and Marcus Aurelius, it's also going to be an element in the Black Mirror episode Archangel. So those of you who've seen Archangel may have noticed that when the daughter is about to become sick with morning sickness because she's pregnant, she gets sick for the first time when she's watching a lecture at her high school on the Oedipus Rex. And what that episode shares basically with the Sophocles version is that to try to avoid your fate is the very way that the tragic character brings it about. All right, so now Nietzsche on tragedy. Why tragedy is the question that Nietzsche discusses or really addresses. And it's an important question that I think you have to appreciate and really feel to get a sense of what Nietzsche's doing in this book. It's a puzzle, if you think about it. Why do we go to tragedies? And we don't go to operatic tragedies much anymore, or dramatic live productions, but we all of us at one point or another go to more or fewer tragic films. These tragic films win Oscars. We recommend them. They stick with us. And the question is, why do we do this to ourselves? And the presumption is that for this to be a puzzle is that we're pleasure-seeking organisms. So why would we subject ourselves to the pain and grief of a dramatic reenactment of a tragedy? Curiously, the answer that is in the background of Nietzsche's treatment is Aristotle's, the other famous treatment of tragedy. Really, I'd say these are the two biggest treatments of tragedy in the Western tradition. And Aristotle's is that tragedy performs an emotional function for us, that it works especially with the emotions of pity and fear. We fear for Oedipus, and we fear for ourselves when we think of the ways in which we're like Oedipus, the ways in which we are able to understand generalities but unable to see specific things about ourselves that might befall us. And those emotions of pity and fear, Aristotle argues, when they are heightened in a tragedy such as the Oedipus, which is also Aristotle's example, we experience what he calls a catharsis. And the Greek could mean either a purgation or a purification. A purgation The meaning there would be that we go to the tragedy and we experience a great welling of pity and fear, and we may even weep, and almost as if pity and fear are humors in our body that are excessive, the way we might have too much phlegm or too much blood. What we need is, in the medical analogy, we need a bloodletting, or we need to cough up the phlegm to get rid of that excess humor. Well, similarly, if pity and fear, the emotional equivalents of the bodily humors, are excessive, well, we go to a tragedy and we purge the excess pity and fear. I'm more inclined to think the catharsis translation should be purification, that we all experience pity and fear, at one time or another to a greater or lesser extent, and that its targets can be crude. We can pity the wrong people, we can fear the wrong events, but that tragedy gives us a kind of education in what we should pity and what we should fear. And so crude emotions are purified or refined. So against that background, Nietzsche asks the basic question, why do we go? And his answer, I suppose, could be summarized in the following way, that we go to tragedy to learn, and yet it's not an intellectual learning, it's an experiential learning. We are put in touch with the real world, which, as I'll describe in a moment, is tragic, is full of suffering, but that we're presented it as pleasurable and even beautiful, so that we emerge from the tragic theater with a deeper acquaintance with life. We've learned to live a real life and not to turn away from the suffering, but that we are able to turn towards it because it has been presented to us in a pleasurable, beautiful way. We feel the power of life without being crushed by it. Now, the background for that explanation that Nietzsche gives, that answer, is that Nietzsche thinks that Silenus was right. So who's Silenus? Well, there are these mythic beasts called satyrs, S-A-T-Y-R, satyrs. They are goat men. They have goat bodies and human heads. And the goat, I'm not a farmer, so I can't testify this directly, but at least in their imagination, the Greek imagination, and the Roman too, the goats are lusty. So the Latin word for a goat is lascivus, and from which we get lascivious. So the goats were lusty, as were the satyrs. And when they were depicted on stage, portrayed on stage by actors, these actors had giant leather phalluses hanging from their waist with red tips to show their constant sexual arousal. So these satyrs are wild, lustful, violent beasts. And one of the most memorable surviving Greek pedimental sculptures, that is, sculptures that remain from the top of a temple, and I believe this is in the British Museum, is of the rape of the Lapith women. So there was a marriage ceremony where a number of Lapith, the tribe or town of Greece, a number of Lapith virgins were being married off simultaneously, and the satyrs, a group of them, burst into the wedding, disrupted it, turned it from order into disorder, and tried to steal away the Lapith women, to rape them in the sense of take them away, but to take them away in the common present sense of rape, to sexually assault them. Yet the chaos is brought under control by Apollo, and this is the memorable statue, which many of you will have seen, even if you don't recall it at the moment, of Apollo, this placid, orderly, powerful god, extending his arm out over the chaos as if to silence it with just the power of his presence. And there we have, dramatized in a sculpture, the contrast between the satyrs, on the one hand, who are followers of Dionysus. So the Dionysian, on the one hand, the disorder, the lust, the violence, no doubt the wine for which Dionysus or Bacchus was the god, but also Apollo, who silences the noise, orders the disorder, resolves the chaos, restores social convention, at least in that sculpture. And that contrast between Dionysus and Apollo is going to be very important for Nietzsche's answer, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So satyrs are these beasts I've described, and one of them is named Silenus. And Silenus was known for being wise, and King Midas, whom many of you will remember from childhood stories as the king who got his wish, which was that everything he touched turned to gold. He asked Silenus for his wisdom. Tell me, Silenus, the truth about human life. And Silenus said, all right, then, I'll tell you. And here it is. Best of all for humans is never to have been born. And next best, if they have the misfortune of being born, is to die as soon as possible. So Nietzsche thought that was true, that the best thing for us is never to have been born, and the next best thing is to die as soon as possible. So we can, distill that as human life is so full of suffering and evil that it's better that it not be, and that if it is, it end as soon as possible. And that is a wisdom that is anathema to many people, but is shared with the dominant, or in the dominant monotheistic faiths of our day. Well, or at least Christianity, which I'm familiar with. So Christianity doesn't think it's better that we never have been, but that's because Christianity sees human life in a broader context where there is a benevolent God who's all-powerful, who supervises it and ensures that if in this vale of tears, which Christians will grant is largely a life of suffering, as epitomized by the cross of Jesus Christ, if the human is faithful and good in this life, then there is a reward that redeems, thanks to, again, the suffering and redemption of Jesus Christ himself, that redeems the suffering. So for Christianity, it's better to have been born than not to have been born, and it's not best to die as soon as possible, but that's only because human life is one moment in a longer story, an eternal story that includes a heaven, not to mention a hell. That said, if Christians were to focus simply on human life and not consider it in light of that broader context, they would agree with Silenus. And I think that's important to remember, that this wisdom is not some alien feature of Greek culture, but something that Christianity subsumes by taking it and placing it into this broader context. So, before we get to Greek religion and Greek tragedy's response to the Silenic wisdom, as I'll call it, just summarize the Christian response, which is that the truth of the Silenic wisdom, when it comes to just human life, simply put, the truth of the Christian religion is that there is pure goodness outside of human life. This is the pure goodness of God himself and of the heaven which God intends for his creatures to inhabit, and that this reality beyond appearance, we don't see heaven with our eyes, but we're supposed to be able to see it with the eyes of faith, that reality beyond appearance redeems the suffering testified by Silenus. That's then, we'll simplify as the answer of monotheism, at least of Christianity. The one God response is that to the suffering of human life is that one God is so powerful and so good that he will save us from the truth of Silenus by putting us in a place characteristic of himself, namely purely good. That wasn't the Greek answer. The Greek answer, according to Nietzsche, was polytheism, not monotheism, where there was no reality of pure goodness beyond the evil appearance of this world. The Olympian gods were a lot like us. So Zeus, there was no pretense that Zeus was a good being. In fact, pick any story at random of those characteristic of Zeus, and he's probably doing something evil. So he's commonly raping human virgins, cheating on his wife and lying to her. The Olympian gods enjoy the Trojan War because, at least except when they have one of their offspring suffer in it, they enjoy the spectacle for the most part, because human beings and the sufferings of human beings give them entertainment. So these gods are not like the Christian God. They're not pure good. Instead, they're nonetheless a response to the Silenic wisdom, because they take that truth of the suffering of human life and they render it beautiful, at least again in Nietzsche's estimation. They don't offer a redemption beyond the appearances in some invisible reality. They redeem the appearances themselves by living them. In other words, the Greek gods make human life living, in short, by living it themselves. Now, they're immortals. They're not mortals, but they suffer human passions. They fall in love. They get jealous. They're violent. They lie. And the fact that gods do that too, and do it on such a grand scale, that gives meaning to human life in polytheism. What was it like to believe in the polytheistic gods? Because it takes a while, I think, especially if you've been raised in a monotheistic, especially a Christian culture, to appreciate what that offers. And the closest parallel I can think of in our culture is the celebrities. So I don't follow celebrity culture myself, but I shop at the supermarket, and there are those tabloids full of pictures and headlines and stories. Obviously, these things are selling. People care about these people, the celebrities. But these people are, human life turned up to 11. They're cheating on each other. They're sometimes violent. Those tabloids love the murder stories, the lies. They care. They're very vain, and yet people are drawn to them, and somehow following them gives, if not meaning to our lives, then at least a distraction from our lives. I'm not exactly sure. Again, I don't follow celebrities, so I'm not exactly sure what the appeal is, but it seems to me something like that is going on with the Greeks' devotion to their gods. All right, so back to tragedy. Nietzsche sees Greek culture before Socrates, certainly before Plato, but even before Socrates. So this culture that Sophocles represents, and even more so Aeschylus, the tragedian before him, this culture he calls a tragic culture. It resisted the temptation that the Greeks later succumbed to, thanks to St. Paul and the conversion to Christianity, the temptation to turn away from this world of appearance and turn towards what the Christians consider the real world, the transformed earth of heaven, the real world of Plato's forms that I mentioned in an earlier episode, and that I'll discuss again, no doubt. Nietzsche thought turning away from this world of appearance, as it's called in those ideologies or philosophies and religions, was a sign of weakness, that the Greeks were singular in their courageous confrontation with the world of appearance, the world simply, when you don't accept that distinction between reality and appearance. They were able to look the wisdom of Silenus squarely in the eyes and accept it and say, nonetheless, I choose this life. I feel the power of what for Nietzsche was this will, the Schopenhauerian will that underwrites this whole text. That is a source of striving and desire, that I feel this source of striving and desire in myself. I see it in my religion. I see it on stage in tragedy. And rather than being crushed and overwhelmed by it, I somehow accept it and see it, although I need a screen through which to see it. And that's what the Olympian deities and ultimately tragedy presents. So Nietzsche understands Greek tragedy as a synthesis of two trends in Greek culture. One is the Dionysian, those satyrs, the Silenic wisdom. And again, Dionysus or Bacchus is the god of wine and disorder, communion. People, including the women, leave their everyday life of social rules and conventions and go into the woods and achieve a deeper, real communion beyond the fake, intercourse of daily life, so that convention is swept aside and a kind of deeper communion is achieved through intoxication and dancing and revelry Again, I think a rock concert, a certain sort of rock concert like a Woodstock or a Grateful Dead, would be an analogy nowadays, or at least was in generation past. So Dionysus, I want to summarize, this is again Dionysus as Nietzsche appropriates him. Dionysus as a god of unity and self-oblivion. That is, you go out into the woods and you join the crowd and you forget yourself. You forget your social role. You forget your obligations. You become intoxicated. You are absorbed into the crowd and you forget yourself. And that this is what the world is really like. The world, as Nietzsche understands it, is a world of pulsing life that is desiring almost without goal, just pure desire that once it gets whatever its immediate object is, desires something else and moves from object to object in this perpetual striving for which there is no solution. Contraposed to this Dionysian trend in Greek culture and in Greek tragedy particularly, Nietzsche sees an Apollonian element. And if Dionysus is the god of self-oblivion, as I've summarized it, then Apollo is the god of self-knowledge. So at the temple at Delphi, there were 7 plaques with mottos, Apollonian wisdom on them. And the one that is really remarked upon, especially for anyone who reads Plato, the Apology, Socrates gets his divine mission when one of his friends, Chaerephon, goes to the temple of Apollo at Delphi and asks, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And for which he gets the answer, no. And what does Socrates do? Well, he tries to find out what is it that the god is saying about him. What is it about Socrates that makes him wiser than any other Greek? So he has to find this out, and the way he goes to find it out is he asks philosophical questions, as we understand them now, of various Athenians. What is justice? What is courage? He goes to the political leaders, he goes to the military leaders, he eventually goes to the artists and asks them these questions. It turns out they don't know the answers to these questions, and so they don't really understand the virtues. And what is it that Socrates has that makes him distinct, makes him a knower? He knows of these things that he does not know them. So he achieves a self-knowledge, and that was one of the 7 mottos on the temple, know thyself. And in later philosophical traditions, that becomes the central theme of philosophy and a strand of Platonism. The goal of philosophy is to know thyself. So this is Apollonian self-knowledge as opposed to Dionysian self-oblivion. And for there to be a self to know, there must be individuals as opposed to the crowd that absorbs the individuals. Apollo is the god of prophecy, as we've seen already illustrated in the Sophocles play. He's the god of order. I mentioned that in the pedimental sculpture where he is calming the chaos at the wedding of the Lapiths. And in Nietzsche's understanding, he's the god of sculpture, dream, and appearance, which contraposes him to Dionysus, in Nietzsche's understanding, the god of music, even though Apollo is also the god of music in authentic Greek mythology, the god of reality, and the god of annihilation in unity. So what does tragedy give us? Well, again, this is a tragic culture. The polytheistic religion already gives us a synthesis of these two things, where we have a god, Dionysus, and we have a god, Apollo, and these are 2 very important gods, and the Greeks didn't feel the need to choose between one or the other, but saw them combine, so that a devotee of both of those gods gets the experience of self-oblivion tempered by the experience of individuation and order that you get from Apollo. But that this trend in Greek culture is brought to its apogee in tragedy, the performance at these religious festivals, particularly the religious festival of Dionysus, the performance of these great works of art where Sophocles, for example, presents us an individual, Oedipus, who is very distinct from everybody else. So there's the Apollonian, and he's very clever. He, as I say, does he know himself? Well, yes, in a way, because he knows human nature. He's able to answer the question that the Sphinx, the riddle of the Sphinx, because he alone knows that humans walk on 3 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 3 in the evening, but he doesn't know himself. That's his tragic flaw, if you will. And so he's an Oedipal, he's obviously an Oedipal figure. He's an Apollonian figure by being a heroic individual, relying on his intelligence, trying desperately to escape his fate. But the Dionysian overwhelms the Apollonian because his self-knowledge is flawed. He doesn't know the particularities of his own life. He doesn't know why, for example, he limps. He doesn't know that that's an inherited curse, that his parents spiked his feet. He doesn't know who his real parents are. He ends up killing his own father and sleeping with his own mother. Despite the many warnings, he fulfills the fate in his very effort to escape it, and he's destroyed. His family is destroyed. He pokes out his own eyes as a witness to how his vision, his intellectual acuity has failed him. And he ends up, as I mentioned, with a cane, disabled, hobbling in exile throughout the Greek world, and becomes a kind of sacred symbol. So that in the next play in this trilogy, because the tragedians wrote, actually tetralogies, they wrote 4 plays in a row, 3 tragedies, as we call them, and then a satyr play, which is sort of a comic relief, if you will. Oedipus is annihilated. The old Oedipus is annihilated, and the reality of the power of the fates assert themselves. So what do we gain as an audience by seeing this spectacle? It's a reassertion of the power of the will or of the fates, the effort of a heroic individual to resist that and yet ultimately is crushed. We see the power and the suffering, but as if through a screen that Sophocles presents us. So we're not just witnessing a battlefield of gore with no meaning, but rather a presentation of these lessons, again, not as propositions the way Socrates will give them to us. And Nietzsche, incidentally, thinks that the Socratic spirit destroys this tragic culture from within. He takes this tragic vision and he thinks that we can achieve happiness through intellection. Socrates is the bridge between the tragic culture of Greece and the Greeks' adoption of Christianity. In fact, Nietzsche jokes that Euripides' tragedies were written by Socrates, as if Socrates was able to spoil Greek tragedy from within Greek tragedy itself. At any rate, the Oedipus play that I've chosen as an illustration of this theory gives us a hero who is destroyed, but is nonetheless an appealing, despite his flaws, individual. And that combination of the individuality and the destruction gives us more than just a spectacle of pure destruction, by which we would be crushed the way we would be traumatized, many of us, by witnessing a battlefield full of meaningless gore. We emerge from the tragic theater ennobled, according to Nietzsche, because of our contact with the reality that we can experience as pleasurable. So that just as the Greek gods give to us human life turned up to 11, and we feel life more intensely, he thinks, by participation in the polytheistic religion, well, so too in the case of Greek tragedy, which was its highest expression. And so I'll just finish with a few quotations of Nietzsche. The signal quotation is the following: "Only as an aesthetic phenomenon are existence in the world justified to eternity." And I think the contrast there is with, again, Christianity, which will be Nietzsche's bête noire through his career. And I suppose you could transmute that quotation into a Christian one by saying, only as a moral phenomenon are existence in the world justified to eternity. How is it that Christianity makes life meaningful? It's by giving it a moral purpose, that we're here for a time to choose good and to scorn evil. And if we do so, we receive the redemption of Jesus Christ, who justifies us as humans despite our original sin, and we achieve eternity in heaven. So the Christian motto, again, will be only as a moral phenomenon our existence in the world justified to eternity. By contrast, as Nietzsche says of tragedy, only as an aesthetic phenomenon our existence in the world justified to eternity. So the Greek tragedians like Sophocles and Aeschylus give us a play, an artifact of beauty, an aesthetic phenomenon, an aesthetic appearance, something to our senses. And through that, justify the world, not because they show us some reality beyond the appearance, but they show us the appearance itself as beautiful. And finally, Nietzsche writes, the metaphysical consolation with which, as I have already suggested here, all true tragedy leaves us, that life at the bottom of things, in spite of the passing of phenomena, remains indestructibly powerful and pleasurable. So Nietzsche thinks that the pleasure that you experience in witnessing the destruction of Oedipus. So we go in the end, why do we go to tragedies? The question with which I began. We go to tragedies for pleasure, but we take great pleasure, I don't want to say in the sadness, in the grief, but rather in the power of the destructive force that brings about that sadness and grief. So that brings us to Freud. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, Freud has in this text a theory not of tragedy, but of dreams. But I hope at the end of this segment that you'll find that Freud's theory matches almost element for element the theory of Nietzsche on tragedy. Freud, incidentally, claimed never to have read Nietzsche in his autobiography, and that he felt the need to say that because people had so often pointed out to him the correspondence between some of his basic ideas and those of Nietzsche. Later, for example, the superego and the role of guilt, something forecast in Nietzsche in the Genealogy of Morality. In any case, here we have the same correspondence, and Freud, who always insisted upon his own genius, felt the need to say that no, he had never read Nietzsche. He was not borrowing it directly from Nietzsche, that he'd come up with it on his own. So let's see. Well, in this essay on dreams, Freud begins from the clinical standpoint, which is what is the position of the analyst, we would say now the therapist, but what is the position of the psychoanalyst when a patient comes with a dream, and he's writing it as a kind of mystery, namely these strange things get reported to you, dreams, and how do you find out their meaning? And he takes you from what we call nowadays the presenting symptoms. What is it that the patient or the analysand brings to the analyst, and tracing it back from that surface, the presentation, tracing it back to the origins in the patient's mind. But I think it's easier to reconstruct from the origins in the patient's mind out to the symptoms, out to the dream, out to the report of the dream. It's easier at any rate for teaching. Maybe it doesn't work as well as a gripping story, and Freud's a good writer. He can write a kind of mystery. That's the appeal of a lot of his treatises. So instead of starting from the examples of dreams that he gives and going back to their deeper meaning, I'm going to start from the deeper meaning, if you like, or from the origin in the mind that he attributes to as the causes of dreams. And the fundamental premise here is that dreams are wish fulfillments. That is, outside of dreaming, what's a wish fulfillment? If you wish for something, you believe that you have it. That's, it's a fallacy of the human mind. It's a fallacy of most children, for example. The fact that they want something so badly, they think that they deserve it, and the fact that they're going to get it. And it takes a while to recognize that the world doesn't respond to your wishes just because you wish them. But Freud thinks that there is a stratum in our mind, no doubt left over from infancy and childhood, that is devoted to fulfilling our wishes by fantasizing that they've come true, and that's the basic mechanism of dreams, that it takes our wishes, and instead of the way we operate as adults in our waking life, takes our wishes and then tries to change the world in order to satisfy those wishes. It takes the more direct route of fantasizing that we've satisfied them and gaining satisfaction thereby. And this, by the way, is one of the reasons that he's so preoccupied with sex, because sex is different from lust, is different from the other appetites in this regard. If you are hungry, you can fantasize about a hamburger or some other food that you wish for, but that satisfaction will only last so long. It won't, in fact, give you it won't resolve your hunger. Your hunger will persist until you eat some real nourishment. Sexual desire is different in that respect, that you can get sexual satisfaction from the wish alone. You don't have to fulfill it in reality to achieve orgasm, quite particularly. So it's one of the many reasons that Freud is interested in sex. Another is that sexual fantasy is highly plastic. It's highly flexible. So that, again, take the contrast with hunger. There are all kinds of cuisines over the world, and everyone has their own particular food tastes, but you will starve unless you get certain amount of calories and certain number of nutrients in certain quantities. There's just a basic template for what satisfies hunger, and there can be variations on that, infinite numbers of variations, but there is a template for satisfaction. That's not the case with sexuality. Some people are sexually satisfied entirely by shoes, for example, or any number of other fetishes, and there's no correspondence to that in hunger. So sexual appetite is highly plastic, and the imagination plays a huge role in that plasticity, and also the imagination alone can be sufficient for sexual satisfaction in a way that the imagination alone is not sufficient for the satisfaction of hunger. All right, so dreams are, according to Freud, wish fulfillments, and now he has the difficulty of explaining how it is that not every dream is satisfying. Not every dream is a simple fulfillment of a wish. And I should have said that he thinks most wishes are sexual. But at any rate, he starts with that theory that dreams are wish fulfillments by observing the dreams of children. He reports seeing a child who didn't get enough strawberries for dinner one night. This is usually one of his grandkids or one of his kids. Didn't get enough strawberries for dinner and has a dream in which the child cries out in the middle of the night, "More strawberries," as it's translated. So he takes that and one or two other instances of children wishing for the very thing, dreaming for the very thing that they were wishing for just before they went to bed as evidence that that's the basic template of dreams. And he calls that wish the latent content. So the contrast is going to be with the manifest content. So there's the latent content, which is what the mind is really wishing for, and the manifest content, which is how the dream appears. And the reason they're different is that some of the things for which we wish make us anxious. And again, thinking of sex, he's thinking of incestuous sex, for example. He thinks it's not unusual for, this gets to his theory of sexuality in another treatise that I'll be discussing in a different episode a little later, but he thinks that it's common for infants to have sexual, in his broad sense, desires for their caregivers because of the bodily contact. And as they mature, they find out that this is disapproved, and they experience anxiety when they experience that wish or desire. And eventually into adult life, that wish for incestuous sex becomes so forbidden that just thinking about it makes us so anxious that we don't even think about it. So that's one of his examples of latent content. Another would be a violent wish against a caretaker as well, which, again, he thinks that infants and children have. So we're back with the Oedipal story of an infant who is fated. And in this case, Freud doesn't think the fates are cosmic, but instead features of the mind, which recalls, and he himself recalls this, an aphorism of Heraclitus that in the Greek it's ethos anthropoi daimon. Ethos is character, daimon is, in this case, fate, daimon from which we get demon. So ethos anthropo daimon, character, anthropo, fate. Anthropo is for a human being. Anthropos is the noun. And stuck in between character and fate is the human being. Heraclitus is deliberately positioning that word there to say, not to privilege neither fate nor character, to say sort of indiscriminately or ambiguously, a human being is stuck between those two things. And a common translation is man's character, or human's character, is our destiny. But you could equally say our destiny is our character, privileging not the one but the other. But it's a typical move of Freud to take what, say, for Nietzsche was a cosmic story, or for Sophocles was a cosmic story about our fate or about the will and the nature of the world, and to put it into character. So instead of being fated to kill his father and sleep with his mother, the child, Oedipus, or just simply the boy, is fated because of his human mind to wish these things. But the wishes are forbidden. Fulfilling the wishes is forbidden. Speaking of them is forbidden. Even wishing them eventually is forbidden when the boy has grown old enough to internalize the prohibitions of his society, that it makes him anxious even to think about those things. And that's why there's a gap between the latent content of the dream and the manifest content of the dream. Because if he were simply to dream about killing his father and winning the affections of his mother and having sex with her, that would make him so anxious that he would wake up. So dreams, according to Freud, are the guardians of sleep. They take the wishes that would make us anxious and they transform them into the manifest content, what he calls a compromise formation. And the compromise is between the wish and what we can tolerate. So it can't be too literally the wish, otherwise we would be so anxious we would wake up, nor can it be so far away from the wish that the wish isn't satisfied. The compromise then is between the wish and our anxiety. And the product of that compromise is the manifest content of the dream. In order to move from the one to the other, Freud describes what he calls the dream work. And he thinks there are 4 techniques of this dream work, and they're at least the first 2 are poetic techniques. So the first is what he calls condensation. An example of this, to take our example earlier of a wish to kill the father and sleep with the mother, thinking of those as 2 separate wishes, then a condensation of those 2 separate wishes into one wish might be part of the dream work. So instead of killing the father and sleeping with the mother, it might be killing the mother and sleeping with the father. The second example of the dream work is displacement. And so killing the father would make me anxious if I were to dream that in the manifest content, but my father has a beard and my boss has a beard, and my boss plays a role in my life rather like my father because he forbids things and commands me to do things, and so I then dream about killing my boss instead of killing my father. And that's a better example, because there it might be that I could dream that and not be made anxious, but in fact enjoy myself in that dream. The real pleasure that I would be getting would be dreaming about killing my father, but I'm avoiding the anxiety of doing so by dreaming about killing my boss. And similarly, if I'm wishing to sleep with my mother, I displace that wish onto most immediately another woman, a woman who looks like my mother, a woman who sounds like my mother. Maybe instead of having sex with her, I have a conversation about sex with her, or I just have a conversation, or even the word sex gets mixed up into some other word. There are an infinite number of ways in which displacement can work. The third of the techniques of the dream work is pictorial representation. So even though the wish has a narrative structure, Freud asserts, as he does with all 4 of these techniques rather dogmatically, that all dreams are pictures, and so the narrative wish has to be converted into a picture. And just as a picture is worth 1,000 words, well, 1,000 words can get into one picture. And finally, when we have all of these pictures, they are assembled into, by the mind, into a story. And the result of these 4 techniques is that you can take a raw, forbidden wish, such as to kill the father, to sleep with the mother, and through condensation, displacement, pictorial representation, and then what he calls primary revision, assembling those pictures that have already been distorted through condensation and displacement, assembling them into a new story through primary revision, the manifest content is produced. So that when the patient comes to analysis and says, well, I had this crazy dream, in order to get back to the original wish, first you have to peel away the layer of primary revision. Whatever the story is probably a false story that's been tacked onto a bunch of pictures that may never have had that story in the first place. And those pictures themselves are representing more complex narratives, each of which has been distorted through displacement and before that condensation, so that ultimately you'll get back to the latent content. Now, the latent content is not always going to be killing your father and sleeping with your mother. That's just the cardinal example and easiest for us because of all the discussion we had earlier about Sophocles. So how do you do that work in analysis? It's not that the patient comes in, tells the dream, and then the analyst in a rote way says, all right, let's undo the primary revision, let's get rid of the pictures, let's undo the condensation, let's move through displacements. Rather, the patient is invited to free associate, the really most important technique of psychoanalysis, which, if any technique can do this, it promises the possibility of bypassing social convention and the anxiety that attends that. So when the patient is invited to say whatever comes to her mind, then, and the analyst is clear that there will be no judgment made upon whatever is said, then the patient can come with the dream and just with the first element that's described, oh, I had a dream last night and I was pilot of an airplane and I was trying to take off, but I couldn't and I crashed into the ocean. Well, that's a story, but again, a simplistic approach to analysis would have the analyst undoing that primary revision. Instead, Freud's saying, allow the patient to free associate. Planes. What do you think of when you think of planes? Or what do you think of when it comes to being a pilot? Oh, well, I once wanted to be a pilot when I was a child. And, we used to live on a street near the airport, and I used to go and watch the planes, and you're off. And through that telling of stories and not that don't even have to be coherent, because a true free association can leap from one element to another, that the displacements, a chain of displacements, can naturally be reversed so that the original story can be undone, the pictures will turn back into narratives, the displacements can be undone through the free association, and perhaps even some of those condensed symbols can start to come apart into fragments, and the wish could be revealed. Well, whatever the value of that technique of dream analysis, I've introduced it today as the final element in this chain from Sophocles to Nietzsche and then finally to Freud, well, with a couple of goals in mind. One of them is to argue that Freud is giving us roughly the same argument that Nietzsche gave, transposed from tragedy to dream. So let's see if you can follow it with me. Remember, with Nietzsche, there was the Dionysian and the Apollonian. The Dionysian was the real. The Apollonian gave us the appearance. Dionysian was beyond logic, unity and annihilation of individuality, self-oblivion. Well, that is the latent content of Freud. That is the raw, primitive, visceral desire of the infant, even of the child, before social convention. Just remember Dionysus, Bacchus takes the citizens outside the city where they can escape social convention. And through the dream work, which is the work of the artist, but here again, Freud has taken the artist, which was an individual in Nietzsche's celebration of Aeschylus and Sophocles, or a culture, which was doing the artistic work with the polytheistic religion. Freud's taking all of that and putting it in the mind. So the dream work is the work of an individual. It's the work of each of us when we go to sleep. Freud has made each of us an artist, a tragedian, if you will. And through condensation, displacement, these are poetic techniques. And it's too bad. He says there are only 4 ways in which the dream work works, Condensation, Displacement, Pictorial Representation, and Primary Revision. I just don't think that's true. I think, well, along with condensation, there'll be fragmentation and synecdoche and metaphor and simile and so on. All the other poetic devices are available to the dream work, just as they're available to Sophocles. And our mind, like Sophocles, converts this latent content, this raw Dionysian element, into a beautiful appearance, a satisfying, pleasurable, manifest content. And for Freud, the redemption in that activity is sublimation. That is, taking our raw, forbidden wishes and presenting them to us in a way that we can appreciate as pleasurable, so that we're not overwhelmed, made anxious, crushed in the Nietzschean, melodramatic way, crushed by the horror of the Dionysian, by the Silenic wisdom. We're not made anxious in Freud by our animal impulses. Instead, we are presented them as beautiful dreams. And I want you to think about, as you watch playtest, and I hope to have a discussion about this, the ways in which the symbols in playtest are produced by something like the Freudian dream work, the way in which playtest itself is a tragedy of Cooper, the character, the American who travels and is destroyed in an Oedipal fashion. I also mentioned Archangel, the way in which the Oedipal story of trying to avoid your fate brings it about. And so with that in mind, so much for Sophocles, Nietzsche, and Freud.